Ready to buy your M1 Mac Mini? Confused by the options? Not sure how to spend your money? I can help. Welcome back to Mark Ellis Reviews. I say it every single time, but thank you for subscribing if you have. If you haven't, just click the button. You won't miss an episode. So out of all the M1 Macs that Apple launched last year, the M1 Mac Mini is arguably the easier one to buy. And that's because there's only one of them. When it comes to the M1 MacBooks, you have the Air and the Pro. And as I've discovered through comments on my previous videos, people are quite confused about which one of those to go for. Now, if that is you, I have created buying guides for both the M1 MacBook Air and M1 MacBook Pro. I'll put them both in the video description, so go and check those out if that is the type of M1 computer you're after. However, if you're after a desktop Mac, a desktop M1 Mac, then there's only one option. It's the M1 Mac Mini. And for a long time now, the Mac Mini has been a brilliant, cost-effective entry into the macOS ecosystem. The M1 Mac Mini is no different. It's still a very affordable, as far as Apple goes, way to get a Mac. But I know why you're watching this video. I know you've got to the point where you're ready to buy, but you're still confused by the options that Apple give you for the M1 Mac Mini. So, let's get straight into it. Now, there are some initial considerations that you need to make with the M1 Mac Mini. For instance, it does surprise some people, and I understand why, because Apple doesn't make it particularly obvious on their website that the Mac Mini doesn't come with anything apart from a power cable. So that means you need to buy a mouse, keyboard, and obviously a monitor. So it's important to budget for those things as well. So I bought the M1 Mac Mini with 16 gig of RAM, a 512 gig hard drive, and I paired that with a Keychron keyboard, Logitech MX Master 3 mouse, and an MSI 34-inch widescreen monitor. I'll put links to all of that stuff in the description, and I have reviews coming up for them in the future, so keep an eye out for that. Altogether, that cost me about 1,500 UK pounds. You compare that against the equivalent iMac, which I know there is no M version of the iMac yet, but yeah, if you compare that with an iMac, or even a MacBook actually, you're getting quite a lot for your money. There's two other things to bear in mind. One of them is that the M1 Mac Mini is having a few Bluetooth issues. Now, since I published my initial thoughts about the M1 Mac Mini, Apple have launched macOS 11.2, and for me, it has fixed pretty much all of the Bluetooth issues. The only thing that I still have an issue with is the Logitech MX Master. I have to use the dongle for this, which comes with it rather than Bluetooth. But everything else, my keyboard, my AirPods, my third-party Bluetooth headphones, all of them now work under 11.2. However, I have spotted in my comments and also on my Medium blog, some people are still having issues with Bluetooth. So if you really rely on certain Bluetooth devices, just do a bit of research and have a look and see if people are having issues with them. There is something wrong with Bluetooth on these M1 Mac Minis, and even potentially the Intel Macs before that. But like I say, for me, 11.2 has completely fixed them, apart from the mouse, but I can get by with the mouse with the Logitech dongle. It's not an issue. So just bear that in mind. The other thing is ports. Now, if you're the sort of person that likes to connect lots of things to the back of your computer without using dongles, the M1 Mac Mini might be a bit of a pain for you. The reason for that is that Apple gives you two USB-A's and two USB-C's, HDMI, Ethernet, headphone connection, that's it. The previous Mac Mini, the Intel version, had more ports than that. Now obviously you can connect dongles and docks and things to it. I've got a really interesting dock on the way actually, which I'm going to review soon, but it is constrained in terms of ports. It's the same thing with the MacBooks, the M1 MacBooks. And as far as we know, it's just a thing with the M1. Bear that in mind. If you've got lots of external drives, for example, you're going to have to get a hub. It's not the end of the world, but it does matter for some people. 8GB versus 16GB. I've spoken a lot about this, so has no end of people. It's a huge debate at the moment, and it's a really interesting debate. The reason it's an interesting conversation is because Apple has changed the game. They've basically launched a chip which has the memory built into it. So you have the CPU, the GPU, and the memory and everything else built into one little chip. And that changes the performance of the device completely. So whereas before 8GB was not a huge amount of RAM, 8GB on an M1 Mac is actually very, very sufficient. Now I can say this because I've got two M1 machines. I've got an M1 MacBook Air, which has 8GB of RAM, and I have an M1 Mac Mini in front of me, which has 16GB of RAM. And I'm not joking, I can't really tell the difference between the two. I use a little program called iStat Menus, which basically tells you what your computer's up to behind the scenes. And on the M1 Mac Mini, if I'm video editing, perhaps producing music, doing pretty processor intensive and system intensive things, It very rarely, if ever, goes above 8 gigabytes of memory being used. So that means, in my mind, I've got tons of headroom. And during everyday tasks, email, web browsing, video calling, writing, all the normal kind of stuff that we do, it's using perhaps 4 gig. It's just, there's so much efficiency going on with this M1 that this concern between 8 gigabyte versus 16 gigabyte for a lot of people is a non-issue. So if your workload is pretty normal, 8 gigabyte will be fine, and it will last you as well. But if you do more intensive stuff, or if you're just the sort of person who likes to have that peace of mind that you have the top spec, the 16 gigabyte will give you no end of headroom. It really will. And I get that if you are that sort of person. It's the reason I got the 16 gig, just because I wanted the top spec. I wanted to compare against the 8 gig as well. But it's just a bit of peace of mind, really. But just to reiterate, I can't really tell the difference between the 8 gigabyte and the 16 gigabyte M1 machine. The thing to bear in mind with the M1 Mac Mini is that, like the M1 MacBook Pro, it has a fan for the CPU. And in my view, you may disagree, if you do, let me know in the comments, but in my view, the presence of that fan is more important than the RAM, the additional RAM that you can have. And the reason for that is that the fan ensures that the CPU doesn't throttle. And by throttling, we basically mean that the CPU won't slow down under intense pressure. So on the M1 MacBook Air, for example, there's no fan in that device at all. So if you do loads of really intensive 4K video rendering, or you're a programmer and you're doing lots of big compiling of huge projects, you're going to push the M1 MacBook Air to the point where it has to slow down the CPU. It will get hot and it will just slow it down, basically. With the M1 Mac Mini and the M1 MacBook Pro, it has a fan. So the fan can regulate the temperature of the CPU and prevent it from slowing down. Now, it's still very difficult to get that fan to go. And I'll be honest, I've had this machine now for quite a while, probably nearly a month now. I've not heard the fan. It's never got warm. And I do 4K video editing. I do a lot of work in Logic Pro, which is a music production application. Whereas my old 16-inch MacBook Pro during either of those tasks would be blaring its fan and getting very, very hot. The M1 Mac Mini doesn't make a sound. I can't get that fan to work. And that just means that there's loads of headroom there. So the fact the fan is there, for me, is more important than the additional RAM. But if you want peace of mind, spend a little bit extra and get that RAM. Storage is a very personal thing. It depends very much on what you do with your computer. I think because the M1 Mac Mini is a desktop machine, I think it's fine to rely more heavily on external storage. I bought the 512 gig version. Obviously you can go down to 256, that's the base level. And for a lot of people, 256 will be fine because modern apps aren't particularly big. If you're a kind of normal user in terms of the stuff that you do with your Mac, then I would get the 256 and get some external SSD storage, which is far more cost effective than Apple's prices. Now the M1 Mac Mini goes right up to 2 terabytes of storage, but that's an $800 option. 2 terabytes is loads of storage. And I think if you want that much storage, you can get a much better deal getting an external drive. And because this is a desktop machine, you're not carrying it around, you can hide the drive behind your desk, Velcro it to the underside of your desk. You can basically hide it out the way if you want to, and it won't bother you, and you just plug it in and forget about it. So my advice when it comes to a desktop Mac like this is to always get external storage. 256 gig is absolutely fine. Again, if you just want a little bit more headroom, there's that word again, then go for the 512 like I did. AppleCare Plus is the thing that Apple tries to get you to put into your basket before you check out. And I usually get it. And the reason I get it is because I run a business and these machines are business machines for me. So I rely on them to get things done that make me money. And if they go wrong, I need to get them fixed. And the great thing with AppleCare Plus is that it will give you 2 additional years of warranty, and that includes accidental damage and all that kind of stuff. You get 24/7 access to their technical team, who are very, very helpful. And it's just, again, great peace of mind. Now, AppleCare Plus for the M1 Mac Mini is just $99, £99, which I think is great. Great value. I'd go for it, even if you're a personal user, actually, because it's quite a bit cheaper than the MacBook AppleCare Plus. So no-brainer if you're a business user. I still think it's pretty much a no-brainer if you're a personal user, but if you can't stretch to it, I wouldn't sweat it, actually. These machines last and last and last. I've got an old Intel Mac Mini, which still works. I don't use it at all, but it still works. It's from 2011, no issues with it whatsoever. So yeah, if you can't afford it, or you just don't want to spend extra money on warranty, I know people sometimes don't like the idea of spending more for warranty. It's fine. I think you'll be okay with it for a number of years, but it's a bit of a no-brainer if you're a business. The M1 Mac Mini is a brilliant entry point into the macOS ecosystem. It always has been, to be fair, but the M1 version of this computer changes the game completely. I use this now as my main computer. It runs my channel, it runs my business, and it has replaced my 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now the 16-inch MacBook Pro cost me £3,500, but I can't really tell a difference in terms of performance when doing things like video editing between that 16-inch MacBook Pro and this M1 Mac Mini. To me, that says an awful lot. And I still feel that I'm not pushing this M1 Mac Mini at all. And that's the most impressive thing about this. I just don't feel like I'm really putting it through its paces yet. So it's a great buy and it will last you for many years. In terms of where you place your money, I really would focus any upgrades on things like the RAM. You only get one choice with the CPU, so you don't have to worry about that. Storage is expensive from Apple, so I would think about just getting external storage if you want to upgrade that, which you can keep adding to over time, which is fantastic. 8 gig if you can afford that. If you can go to 16 gig, go for it, but don't lose sleep over those 8 gigabytes that you're potentially going to be missing out on. Now, if you want the M1 Mac Mini's power, but you want it in mobile form that you can work from the sofa on or take to your favorite coffee shop and work from, then keep watching for a link to my M1 MacBook Pro buying guide. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.